everyone to the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform Committee's 18th meeting of 2020. We'd especially like to welcome Liz Smith, who joins the committee for her first meeting today, and I'd like to thank Annie Wells for her contribution to the work of the committee over the past months. We have apologies today from Claudia Beamish and Finlay Carson. Finlay Carson has been substituted today by John Scott, so a welcome to John Scott as well. Our first item today is I'd like to invite Liz Smith to declare any relevant interests. Liz Smith.
No relevant interest to declare.
Thank you. Right. Agenda item 2 is we continue taking evidence on the UK withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Bill, and we have 3 panels this morning. I'd like to welcome our first panel who are joining us just now. We have Robbie Kernahan, the Director of Sustainable Growth for Nature Scot, and we have Terry Ahern, the Chief Executive for the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency. Good morning to you both. We are going to get right stuck in with a very direct question to you both about the proposed Environmental Standards Scotland organisation. And I want to ask you both in turn how you envisage working with ESS and just your general feelings about your potential relationship and what that relationship is going to be with this new agency. So I'll maybe come to Robbie Kernahan first of all.
Good morning. Thank you, Convener. Well, I think first and foremost, the creation of a new body with oversight for environmental governance is quite exciting. But what the bill does, I suppose, is help just clarify the powers that body will have, which, broadly speaking, we welcome. There's still a few questions about the nature of the relationship we will have, and in thinking about the interaction between us, a lot of that is going to be about where their focus is, Environmental Scotland, Standards Scotland, how they set up, and the types of cases that they're going to explore. And I think that the policy memorandum which supports the bill helps explain that to a certain extent, in the fact that the model, I think, is going to be focused on prevention and remedy in a supportive style, working with Nature Scot very much in partnership. But of course, ESS will have quite a lot of discretion about how they investigate cases. And our expectation is that that will only really relate to a handful of cases on an annual basis where there's kind of high profile, significant environmental risk. So very much replicating the way that we see cases being referred to Europe currently. And very much looking forward to establishing that relationship once ESS is up and running.
Thank you. Terry Ahern.
Thank you. So it's a new organisation, and the question is, in the way it's set up and the way it works and the way organisations like SEPA work with it, will it add value or will it detract value? And we think it's quite promising in the way that it's being set up, because we do think it can play quite a positive role. The sort of things that we will work with the organisation when it starts in early days, so I'm imagining the sort of conversation I would have with the chair, the chief executive, would be, we're already overseen by various other bodies and processes. So we report to this committee on various issues, for example. People can hold us to account by testing our individual regulatory decisions through court and other review processes. The Ombudsman sits there to review other ways we administer things. So what's the particular role that this body can play? And we think that the focus on strategic issues, are we and others getting it right on particular, in a strategic sense. So if I take practical example, probably the 2 most contentious things in terms of what we regulate, and the comment that's come from a variety of people have been the Exxon Shell site at Mossmoran and aquaculture. Now, there will always be things that a regulator is regulating where there are different views in the community, and quite rightly questions about whether we're discharging our responsibilities properly. The thing that we think is promising about the way that the legislation and the policy advice is being set up at the moment is that would be strategic questioning of whether we're doing the right thing. So I think particularly because we're putting a big emphasis in both of those cases, and we will do it wherever there are difference of views, is how do we try and bring the parties together? As some members on the committee know, having been involved in both issues, that can be very difficult. And so the things in the way that the body seems to be it's envisaged that it'll be set up, as Robbie said, that there won't be early intervention. It will allow us to do our regulatory role, work with, for example, in the Moss Moran case, residents who are very concerned, work with the businesses, work with other regulators. It won't help us if it intervenes early, etc., and doesn't enable us to do our job. To, for example, then strategically say at some point, are you really regulating major industrial facilities in the right way around an issue like flaring would be, we think, as seems to be envisaged, the valuable role that it could play in the gap, because actually the individual regulatory decisions can already be tested, questioned through other legal processes. So we envisage that could add a lot of value, because it's another oversight body that can say, this is a big strategic issue for the environment, or this is a big issue for the environment. Strategically, are you getting this right or wrong? And then work with us. And if we've got it wrong, give us guidance, etc., about how we should fix things. So that's the nature of the relationship that we would envisage that we see coming from the discussions we've been having with officials involved in drafting and from what we've looked at in terms of the bill.
Of course, Terry, what you won't want is any kind of overlap in responsibilities or confusion about who does what. I mean, that is probably a concern that's been raised by a few people. You know, where does SEPA sit and where does ESS sit, and what gap are they filling? You mentioned in your submission that you have concerns about the name of the body as well, potentially being misleading.
Yeah, I mean, that, I guess the name is the gift wrapping around the present, and maybe it makes a difference, maybe it doesn't. But yeah, what's important is that people understand. So again, if I take that practical example, the people who are concerned about the Moss Moran facility have lives to lead, have kids to raise, etc. You don't want them spending a lot of time. Well, do we go to the Ombudsman? Do we go to this oversight body? Do we talk to the parliamentary committee? So, I mean, I wouldn't live and die by the name, but yeah, I think there could be other names which would more accurately describe what it does, which is probably not a great thing to say, because you might say, what would I suggest? It might come back with something.
I'm going to bring in Mark Ruskell, who has a question. Mark?
Thanks, Convener. It's just specifically about Moss Moran, and I think it's a useful example. Would you see ESS actually having a role in relation to joint work that you do with the Health and Safety Executive? Because I'm aware that a lot of your regulatory functions are shared with other bodies. Would you see ESS having a role in that joint work as well?
Yeah, I think it will always be, and you've been very personally involved in this, if we're in a flaring incident or we're reviewing an incident and it comes in and tries to get in too early, I don't think that's helpful. But if at some point it says, is the connection between the two organisations working well? Is the way that health and safety regulation and the way that environment protection legislation and regulation, does it knit together well, or does it go like this? And to use Moss Moran as a case study and as an example, because we think we should be held to account for the individual regulatory decisions. And it seems to me that what this body should be doing is saying, okay, well, if you look at one or more regulatory decisions, there seems to be something that's not quite working here. Can we come in and have a look at that and work with you on it?
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. I want to just probe the remit of ESS in relation to responsibilities of SEPA and Nature, Scott. And there are two bits to it. Obviously, the environment is affected not simply by the two bodies we have in front of the panel today. Our transport agencies affect the environment and so on. But it's important that we understand whether you, as Nature Scotland SEPA, think that the current definitions for the ESS sufficiently cover the work of your two bodies, or does it need to be further extended? And although you're not speaking for anyone else, do you think it sufficiently covers the wider responsibilities that government may have to discharge in other parts of government that are also environmental.
I'll maybe go to Terry Ahern first, and then I'll come to Robbie Kernahan.
I think in terms of our responsibilities, the legislation, I mean, for a start, this goes further than what we currently have in Europe, because it makes sense, because the European system is looking at a set of nation states, whereas this is for one jurisdiction. So we don't get, for example, the direction that we might get, a direction notice that we might get from this body. So that's, we understand that, because it's a different gap that it's trying to fill. It would seem that ability for the body would apply to a wide range of things that SEPA does. So I think I'm comfortable with that again, it would be more that it does it at the right time with the right focus. So I would say, if this operates well, we'll be held to account and help to do our job properly across a wide remit. I'd have to say I haven't really thought as hard about, because I've been thinking about, well, how this apply to SEPA. I haven't thought as hard about how would it apply to other agencies and bodies and parts of government in terms of their responsibilities. I suppose, though, if it's looking at any issue, so if you take the example that you raised, Mark, and if it was looking at industrial facilities and how health and safety and SEPA work together, there would be nothing to stop us saying, well, also, if the planning system worked like this, it might be easier to discharge the joint health and safety regulations and environment protection regulations more effectively. So I think certainly in terms of scope for SEPA, it seems to be very broad. In terms of scope for others, haven't turned my mind as much to that, and we can come back to the committee afterwards, but I think there is some scope there.
Robbie Kernahan?
Thank you. I think what the scope of ESS is really helpful, I think, from our point of view on a number of basis. So the new body will provide, I think, reassurance to Scottish Government about to what extent European legislation primarily has been complied with. And I think there are still some questions about scope of ESS and whether it's restricted to providing oversight on EU-derived legislation, or whether it's actually looking at environmental legislation domestically as well. So some clarity on some of that, I think, would be helpful. But in terms of how the body will operate, not just with ourselves, but with other public authorities, I think it's quite interesting to reflect on what Terry said there, because, of course, we want to establish a relationship with ESS on the nature of our functions and ensure ourselves that we are operating to the highest possible standards. But we are, I think, reassured by the fact that there is a little bit of additional independent oversight to take other public authorities to task and scrutinise what they're doing in relation to land management, housing, transport, local authorities, for example, to make sure that in discharging the expectations placed on them as public bodies in complying with European legislation, that it's a welcome addition, I think, to the landscape in Scotland to provide that oversight and to do that in a way which is tailored to the Scottish context. But again, I think what we need to be reassured is that we've not got a wide-ranging environmental watchdog who are not clear as to what type of cases they're going to investigate. So I do think we are keen to ensure that when we're talking to ESS, that they will be operating proportionately and focusing on some of those key issues, which we know are systemic rather than individual case-by-case basis. So the criteria by which ESS actually start thinking about what types of cases and how they're going to work, I think will take a little bit of time to bed in.
Stuart?
Yes, I'll make this a brief final question, which only requests a short answer. And that is just simply whether the exclusion of finance and budgets from the ESS remit is something that you think is right, particularly in the context of a green recovery.
If we maybe come to Mr. Kernahan first.
I think there are still some questions about the budget for ESS and also the complement of staff, because some of the areas that they're actually going to be exploring are fairly specific, and whilst there's a modest staff complement and the estimate of limited budgets, I think we will still have some concerns about to what extent they begin to rely on expertise, from SEPA colleagues and Nature Scott in terms of discharging their functions. But broadly speaking,
Terry Ahern?
If I've understood the question, we don't have a particularly strong view on the finance and budget issue.
Okay, that's fair enough. Come to questions from John Scott.
I'm turning now to international obligations, but before I do, I should declare an interest as a farmer and landowner. But in written evidence, SNH stated that the functions of ESS as currently described would rule out oversight of obligations set out in international conventions such as the Ramsar Convention and the Berne Convention. Therefore, I would like to ask you, what should ESS role be in relation to international law and obligations to which the UK signatory?
Right, maybe come to Robbie Kernahan first of all.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And again, I think it just comes back down to clarity of what we mean by the environment in this bill. There are some questions about whether or not it even includes the Habitats and Birds Directive as defined in EU law. So I think that is something we would be quite keen to continue to explore to ensure that we do get absolute clarity about the definition of the environment. And currently, as described, I think our interpretation is that would probably rule out oversight of some of those international obligations. So there's some questions about whether or not we want to tidy that up to ensure that it does include Ramsar specifically and the Berne Convention and other issues which are perhaps of worthy of further consideration in a Scottish context. Landscape, for example, in terms of environmental definitions. So I think there is scope just to be a little bit clearer about the term and what it actually pertains to in terms of legal obligations.
Terry Ahern.
Yes, I just agree with what Robbie said. I mean, there will be a fair bit of international law that's actually translated into Scottish law that we administer. So, most of the environment protection laws are based on EU directives. So I know it's a slightly different point, but there's a fair bit that is translated into Scottish law. So if we're administering it, then the body would have oversight of it. But take the point that there are going to be potentially some grey areas.
John, do you have any further questions?
Yes, SEPA support replicating the strategic approach taken by the European Commission to enforcement and therefore strongly agree that ESS that should not be able to take formal compliance action on individual regulatory decisions by public body. Others don't take that view. So what should ESS role be when an individual regulatory decision by a public body appears to contravene environmental law?
Go to Terry Ahern, excuse me.
So I think, again, a couple of points. First of all, if we make a regulatory decision that seems to contravene law, there are existing appeal processes, and that's why we think a system works well if bodies are clear about what their particular role is. Now, and we think that should be the route. If people think we've made the wrong decision, whether it's a business we regulate or someone else, they will have appeal rights. If ESS looks at it and says, we just think you're getting this wrong, then again, what I would like and what I'd be saying to them when they're set up is, look, even if that's the case and it's not your jurisdiction, we would want you to raise it with us and have a chat to us about it so you understand where we're coming from, whatever the court's decided. And then that would just go on their radar for if they are then to look at any point at a strategic review, then they're well informed. But we would be pretty clear, we'd stick to our evidence, and it sounds like we're disagreeing with some others. We think individual decisions are individual regulatory decisions and there are existing processes, and it won't help anyone if you blur that line very strongly. And again, I think the role the body can play is saying, hang on, there seems to be something strategically that's not right, that might be given rise to by one or more decisions, and that's the point they can come in and add value.
Yeah.
Robbie Kernahan, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thank you, convener, and I agree entirely with what Terry's suggested there. There are existing appeal mechanisms within the Scottish context for how An individual or an organisation can make representation or challenge individual decisions. I think whilst there is still uncertainty which exists about the exact nature of the cases that ESS will investigate, our hope and expectation is that they are not necessarily looking at what we might consider run-of-the-mill complaints or indeed individual cases, because for the majority of our functions, those appeal mechanisms already exist. And that would be our plea, that ESS remain strategic and look at some of those underlying issues which seem to be cropping up time and time again, and focus their energies in that way rather than.
Following on the theme of appeals and compliance, I come to Angus MacDonald, who has some specific questions around that. Angus.
Okay, thanks, Convener. On the issue of the courts, the written evidence that we've received from SEPA implicitly suggests concern that the sheriff courts will not have the expertise to deal with an appeal against a compliance notice issued by ESS, noting or pointing to the Scottish Land Court as an alternative. So would Terry Ahern in particular say that appeals and judicial enforcement of compliance notices be heard in a specialist judicial forum such as the Scottish Land Court as opposed to the Sheriff Court?
So, yes, I mean, there's a couple of mechanisms. So you can either go to a specialist court, or you could have particular members of the judiciary, if it's not in a specialist court, having particular training and expertise in it. So, you know, we put in our submission where we prefer to see it to go. The key thing is that whoever's hearing it, it's important for both us and whoever has raised the case, and for ESS, that it's being heard by people with the expertise and experience, and they're equipped to deal with it. We put a preference there about where we think that should go. There are other mechanisms to achieve it.
Robbie Kernahan.
I think just in summary, I mean there are a range of routes whereby people can appeal decisions, certainly that we've made and others have made, whether that's public local inquiry, whether it's the land court, whether it's the sheriff court, or judicial review. So I think from our point of view, if ESS are to issue a compliance notice to a public authority to correct a failure to comply with environmental law, our expectation is that we will continue to work in partnership with ESS in order to reach a mutually acceptable solution. That's the steer we've been given, and the conversation we've had with officials is it's very much working in partnership to deal with those types of situations.
Okay, thank you.
Angus, other questions?
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I want to move on to talk about the issues that may arise with cross-border working with Liz Smith. Liz.
Thank you, and good morning. I am particularly interested in the relationships that you have with your counterparts in the rest of the UK, and whether they share the same objectives of you, or whether there are specific challenges that you can point to where there might be obviously a divergence when it comes to common purpose.
Maybe go to Terry Ahern first of all.
So we work very closely with our counterparts in the other parts of the UK, and also we've maintained very strong relationships with our counterparts in Europe. Now, the analogy I make, and apologies if you're not football fans, but we're the referee, so it's parliaments that set the laws and we administer them. So what we try and do when we do that is, if there's similar laws, we work very closely to try and have common approaches that suit our jurisdictions. So, for example, the CEOs of the 4 EPAs in the UK, we meet a couple of times a year. We have pretty regular contact. There'll be working groups on nearly every topic that we regulate. So I will have staff who, for example, with farming interests, will know how the English Environment Agency, how the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, how Natural Resources Wales are regulating farming issues. And we try as much as possible to have common approaches. And we also try as much as possible, where our approaches are not common, to understand where we diverge, so that we can make that as easy as possible for the people we regulate. And I think also there's this issue of there's not just the black and white administration of law. So as new issues come up, we keep very strong relationships with the other bodies so that we can try and understand the best ideas, the best evidence, etc. We share resources. We don't all necessarily do all the same science on something. And I think the final bit of the jigsaw is we work very closely with the relevant trade bodies. So, we've got a very strong relationship, just to pick one, with the National Farmers Union of Scotland, who also obviously have very close relationships with their counterparts in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, so that we can identify divergences, problems, and try and take common approaches as much as possible. And in a sense, whatever the law is, that's actually hugely critical to administer law well. So yeah, it's a thing we've had in the past. It's a big asset that we have, and we will continue to maintain that.
Robbie Kernahan?
Yeah, thank you. I think broadly speaking, our position at NatureScot is very similar to that of SEPA. We've got very good, close working relationship with statutory nature conservation bodies in England and in Wales and in Northern Ireland. And we meet regularly to compare notes and contrast. And whilst there are obviously legislative differences in terms of how our functions are discharged in terms of detail, broadly speaking, we are fully aligned in what we're aspiring to do in raising the awareness and promoting nature across the UK. We share similar objectives in terms of the tools we're provided in terms of protected areas and licensing. We share similar customers and stakeholders in terms of local authorities, NGOs. So we do work fairly closely together as far as we can. And I think the other thing which we have as statutory nature conservation bodies is we have the benefit of the Joint Nature Committee, which allows us actually to have conversations about where we can work more closely together and set common standards for things like monitoring protected areas and species. So we do work as close as we can, recognising that there are differences for legitimate reasons, but trying to ensure consistency where we can.
Liz?
Yeah, just very quickly, and it's a yes/no answer. Do you feel that these relationships will be enhanced with the new body that will exist?
I'm not entirely sure because of the geographic remit of ESS being solely based on Scotland. That will make much difference to our relationship with colleagues at Natural England and NRW, for example. We see it having a significant impact.
Yeah, I probably agree with Robbie. I guess the thing to say is they'll have oversight bodies, and all relationships work well based on how people operate. That's a pretty obvious point. So, for example, if we've got a big divergence between the oversight body in England from Scotland on particular issues, that actually might make it more difficult for us to get common approaches with our counterparts. Now, once more, that might be appropriate because the laws might be different and they're different jurisdictions making different decisions. This is why for us, and we emphasise this in our submission, the key thing is the relationship that we need to quickly establish with ESS so that we do have, for example, we can raise those sort of issues. So I think Robbie's right. It probably won't make much difference, but we need to make sure in the way the relationships are set up that we get the open door and the understanding of the variety of things that need to be considered so we can avoid that being a problem where it occasionally might be.
Thank you.
Liz, do you have any more questions?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to questions around environmental principles, and I'll turn to Mark Ruskell.
Yeah, thanks, convener. I'm sure that the panel has been aware of some of the previous evidence sessions that we've taken on this, and there are different views about the adequacy of the principles that have been written into the bill. Two areas of concern that have been raised with us have been around the omission of the principle of integration of environmental policy, which of course is reflected in the EU treaties, and the omission of the principle of a high level of environmental protection in this bill. I wonder if you could just lay out what your views are on those two principles, And I guess I would expect that as regulators, you would instinctively be in favour of a high level of environmental protection, but perhaps you could explain what your views are based on.
I'll go to Terry Ahern first.
So there's already a fair bit. So, for example, in our Act, there's an integration principle in terms of economic, social and environmental objectives. Some people do question a little bit how that's worded, but it says the environment, you need to integrate, and the environment, if there's any conflict, needs to take priority in the way SEPA discharges its abilities. So we already think, and given that most of the laws we administer also will be based, they've come from being based on those principles, we think that there's adequate, I don't think safeguards is the right word, adequate guidance set through the current processes to ensure that the laws we administer adhere to those sort of principles. So again, perhaps have a slightly different view to some of the submissions and some of the views that have been expressed to the committee.
Bobby Kernahan?
Yeah, I've followed this discussion last week and the previous week with some interest, and like Terry, I mean, the principle of integration, I think, is actually reasonably well embedded in some aspects of legislation already in Scotland. And I also take on board what officials said about trying to ensure that the key principles, and I think those key principles, the four exist within this bill, are actually the key principles of environmental governance we need to see sustained and embedded in Scotland. But of course, we do want to see a high level of protection in Scotland, and whether that needs to be embedded in the principle or not, I don't think Nature Scot has got a firm view. And as Terry's already said, there are certain aspects of these principles that are embedded in various bits of legislation, both which we regulate and others use already. So I think, in summary, whilst we've noted the discussion, I don't think Nature Scot's got any firm views about the need for or not of additional principles. We note that there were opportunities in the consultation to include more, but I can understand the logic of keeping focused on the four that exist in the current provisions.
So I take on board, Terry, and your own point there about the integration principle embedded in existing laws. But does that ensure that integration will happen in future laws that are being constructed? Is there a danger that over time that principle of integration could start to wither? I'm also interested in Terry's view on the principle of high level of environmental protection. I don't think you commented on that.
On the second point, sorry, Convener?
Carry on.
On the point of where it could be applied, there's also other options such as through strategic environmental assessment, where the principles, when you're making key strategic decisions, the principles can be considered. In terms of high level of environment protection, again, don't think we have a hugely strong view, but the laws that we administer tend to be based on that. Whether in future they will or not, yeah, I mean, it's a matter for speculation and consideration. I don't feel, I guess as an administrator of EPA, I don't feel constrained by that, but I can understand the other side of the argument, Mark.
Okay. I've got another question then about the options around, having regard to the environment as it's articulated in this bill. And we've had evidence that, there are other ways to frame that, and other ways that that's been framed in the UK legislation as well. So there's have due regard to, and there's take into account. Now, do you have a view on the different legal phrasing of this having regard to, and which one do you prefer? Do you like the one that's in the bill, or do you think it could be stronger? And what do you see as the differences with due regard or taking into account? How does that differ?
Thanks, Convener. Yeah, I mean, this will always get down to, I guess, what administrators and then in particular what courts will interpret. So probably on that point, I'd have to check with my legal advisors about, how much those words they think would make a difference, and I come back to the committee with supplementary answer. But intuitively, I'm not sure it has a huge impact, which particular words. What's important is that sort of phrase is in there. But yeah, sorry, Mark, I couldn't really comment on the particular phrasing, but can come back if you'd like further information from us on it.
Yeah, always. Doors always open for supplementary information that anyone wants to send to us. I don't know whether Robbie Kernahan has anything to add. Robbie?
Yeah, just very briefly on Mark's point. Again, I don't think NatureScot has got any strong views, Mark, about the extent to which have regard, have a duty to actually make meaningful difference. I know, again, we've got experience of existing wording whereby all public authorities have got a duty to take into account, biodiversity, and we've seen that manifest itself in terms of a number of ways. And I think what we must guard against is that there's a danger that having regard or complying with these principles, whichever formulation is chosen, creates a reporting regime for public bodies, or at least an audit requirement to show how they've met those requirements in case of challenge. I don't think we see the need for another reporting duty, particularly as we carry out, our role appropriately. It implies that we already follow these principles. But I do get the point. It's important to make sure that we ensure that these principles are embedded as strongly as they possibly can be, and all public authorities embed them, and both in terms of projects and potentially new legislation. So it's important we get it right, but I don't think NatureScot can really help advise on the specifics of the wording. I think that needs environmental lawyers.
Okay.
Mark, thank you. I've got a question, I guess particularly about NatureScot's submission to us, and just to get flesh out a little bit about what you drew the committee's attention to a contrast, your words, between proposed duty and statutory duties on public bodies in relation to biodiversity. Robbie, can you explain a little bit more about what you mean there?
Yeah, I'm just building on that point, convener. Really, is that there are already some statutory duties placed upon public bodies. And the point I'm making about biodiversity, there is already a duty placed on public bodies to take into account biodiversity in discharging their functions, as far as is relevant. And I think what we've seen is that from the Nature Conservation Act, that duty being placed very firmly upon public bodies maybe hasn't necessarily delivered some of the recognition that we might have liked to have seen in terms of how that duty is discharged. And I think that's why we're just making reference to that in relation to embedding these principles, because fundamentally I think the trick here is to ensure that those principles actually are subsequently transferred and discharged into more clearer guidance about how public bodies and all relevant public authorities actually need to take that on board. So whilst I think the legal basis is important, it really manifests itself in terms of how these things are discharged in practice. And I think we've got some questions about how successful that has been, even when we're placing a very formal duty on public bodies. That's the point I think we're trying to make.
And I've got a further question for both of you around you meeting your environmental protection and natural heritage obligations when we're responding to the climate and ecological crisis that we're facing. If the applicability of the principles was extended beyond the strategic environmental assessment to all public sector decision making, would that make your job easier? Robbie?
Yes, I mean, happy, I think, again, because our reading of embedding these principles is that, all Scottish ministers will have a duty to have regard to the principles. on a broad range of policy decision making, and I think that's really important for us. So this is not just about SEPA's remit, and it's not about Nature Scott's remit. It's about the broad suite of policy making, and including the development of much wider legislation. So in summary, I think we see, all public bodies having a duty to have regard to these principles is really helpful for us in helping deliver that nature-rich future which we envisage.
And Terry, your thoughts on that proposal?
So it gets a little bit back, just reflecting a little bit more on the previous question about the wording with regard or take into account. I've just been thinking about it. I've worked in different jurisdictions. Sometimes the wording of the law is absolutely essential, and sometimes it doesn't make quite as much difference. And I've been thinking about it. Whatever it's said, I don't think that phrasing really affects decisions. So similarly with this, I think what's most critical in terms of these duties and responsibilities, often these duties are placed on a wide variety of public bodies or ministers, etc. And some official then just has to write a report saying this is what we've done to comply with the duty. I think the more important thing, and it's what's pleasing about the way the body seems to be set up, is to have the right relationships. And for example, for us to get a strategic relationship with Transport Scotland about how to build an integrated transport system that will reduce environmental impact, not just in construction, which traditionally is what we've done, but in how it operates to reduce carbon emissions by having the right sort of travel. A duty can play a role in doing that, but actually what's more important is to have key decision makers being aligned strategically, working together, having the right partnerships, working in combination with communities, private sector. If you think about coming out of the COVID situation, as eventually we'll hope, what will reduce transport emissions will be employers, employees, transport bodies, local councils working about how we do our work differently. Now, a duty might help with that to some degree, but actually I don't think that's probably the key thing. It's the relationships and the strategic alignment that's critical.
Yeah, thank you. Come back to Mark Ruskell for some more questions around this.
Yeah, I mean, it partly comes back, I think, to the question that I think Stuart Stevenson was initially exploring, and it's about the exclusions in the bill. The example you just used there, Terry, of a budget, perhaps for transport, that in itself wouldn't be included under the provisions of the bill because budgets are excluded, but obviously plans and programs would come under that kind of scrutiny. So I'm just wondering if you've got any more thoughts on budget processes. Is it possible that individual budget lines, for example, might not be part of plans and programs and therefore not captured by the provisions in this bill?
Yeah,
Terry first.
Oh, thanks, convener. Yeah, I know you'll sometimes be potentially frustrated when an official says, "Well, that's a little bit beyond my remit." But I'm really here thinking about how does SEPA do its job under this proposed legislation. I wouldn't have a strong view, or we wouldn't have a strong view on that issue about budgets, etc. I don't think.
Okay.
Yeah, much the same, Mark. It's not something I think Nature Scott can really offer a strong view on in terms of the rights and wrongs of including budget settlements and how that ties in with this bill. That's just not something I think we can offer a view on.
Okay, could I ask about another exclusion, which is defence? Now, I'm just wondering, obviously defence is an overriding concern, and I think it's excluded from the provisions of SEA as well. But I'm just wondering what your thoughts are, particularly SNH, on that. I mean, would it be appropriate for, say, the Ministry of Defence to have due regard to impact on whales and dolphins, for example, through military activities? I mean, how are we meant to deal with environmental impact from defence operations otherwise?
In terms of legal provisions, Mark, I think both this legislation and existing legislation, it makes exemptions for certain activities. And defence is one of those really interesting things where there's an overriding public interest or perceived overriding public interest. And we've seen that in terms of domestic legislation and European legislation that recognises, whilst there's a policy intention, there are certain things which will probably override some of the legal mechanics of what a bill is trying to do. I think, what can I say about defence in this situation other than to what extent will a public authority comply with environmental law? We would hope that the Ministry of Defence and certainly the land that it manages will be cognisant of these principles, absolutely, as far as it is able in discharging its own functions. And it comes back down to some of the comments I made about the biodiversity duty. These biodiversity duties apply to public authorities as far as it impacts on their plans and projects. So I think that's the aspiration. How these things are subsequently discharged and meaningfully in terms of what public authorities do, including defence, I think will largely depend on the nature of their actions and the specifics of what it is they're actually doing. If that makes sense.
Mark, are you happy with that? Will I move on to the next section? I don't know whether there's anything else you want to ask. I'd like to ask some questions and take the panel members on to part one of the bill, which is around the keeping pace part of it, keeping pace with the standards, environmental standards of the EU. And you've both been supportive of that in your submissions and other discussions that we've had from you. Of course, what we've got alongside that is the proposed UK, the white paper on the UK internal market. And I wanted to ask you both whether you think those two things are compatible, is there potential problems alongside that, the keeping pace powers on the one hand, but anything that happens as a result of the internal market legislation that's coming forward from the UK government. Maybe come to Robbie first of all.
Thank you, convener. And yeah, I mean, you've seen our response. We are obviously welcoming the intention of this bill to align as far as we can. Evolve Scottish legislation with EU legislation. That's the policy intent, and obviously we're supportive of that. But I think you've heard both last week and a fortnight ago just some of the uncertainty surrounding governance and internal market implications. Heard previous people speaking about the complexity and some of the speculation and second guessing around what the white paper on internal markets might actually mean. So I think for me, it's probably difficult to comment meaningfully until we see some of the detail and draft provisions emerging from those discussions. I think quite a lot of those arguments have been rehearsed in previous sessions, and there's maybe not much more I can add from a Nature Scot perspective.
Well, Yvonne, I'll ask you what your organisation, what involvement you've had around the establishment of these common frameworks that you hope will give you some of the clarity around this.
So, I mean, Nature Scot sits on an EU programme board convened by our colleagues in Scottish Government, the Environment and Forestry Directorate, and doing everything we can to make sure that we keep abreast and prepare and ensure we are cited and aligned as best we can for EU exit. We're not directly involved in any of those discussions, but working very, very closely with officials in Scottish Government to make sure all of those common frameworks which impact on our remit are dealt with adequately. And you know, as we've heard from previous attendees, some discussions on frameworks such as fisheries seem to be making progress, and others it's very, very difficult to know just exactly where the stumbling blocks are. From our point of view, again, I think I alluded to the fact that we know we've got experience of setting common standards and frameworks through JNCC for things which directly affect our remit, and we know we can do that. But that's probably about as much as I can say, because it's not something Nature Scot are actively involved with, the active negotiation of any of those frameworks.
Would you have been expecting that these common frameworks would have been nailed down by now?
I think it goes without saying that the closer we get to the end of this calendar year, the more nervous everybody is, and it would shame that we're in this position. So yes.
I'll turn to Terry Ahern, and if you can answer some of the questions that I've just put to Robbie there, from your perspective at SEPA.
So support what Robbie's just said, so I won't repeat it, just emphasise a couple of points from our perspective. The Scottish Government officials have been extremely good about involving us in the technical development of those frameworks and other rules and systems that are needed. Obviously, it's for parliamentarians to work out the issues around internal market, etc., across the jurisdictions. From a technical point of view, perhaps the thing that I would add is there are some areas where having commonality or ensuring things are easy are perhaps more important than others, and they'll often be around products, so things like chemicals, the emissions trading system where you need it to apply across a certain market. So again, it's beyond my remit to say what the ultimate framework should be, the overall level, but certainly that technical level, the criticality of having the technical input to make sure things work as clearly as possible so it's easy for people to work out what to do is the most important thing. And that's where we've been having our input, and the doors have certainly been strongly open from Scottish Government officials to make sure that expertise that SEPA has is well harnessed and used.
You said, Terry, that you proposed that a mechanism will be needed to assess provisions that come out of the EU in the future and determine whether and how they fit with Scotland's ambitious environmental agenda. How do you see that working, and are there any other models out in the other arrangements around the globe where you've seen that working?
Yeah, so if you look at the current set of EU environmental law, and you take the directives, and this is important in a keeping pace discussion because originally environmental protection, environmental protection as distinct from nature protection and enhancement, has been a lot about specific management of specific issues. So that might be standards for factories or runoff from farms, etc. Then the later directives have been, circular economy and so on, where you're trying to get the system to use the environment more sensibly. So I think some of the future development, and when we look at keeping pace, will be, as a couple of you, including you, convener, were on that ecological footprint Earth Overshoot Day webinar we had last night, the parliamentary reception. That is about the overall economic and social system, Earth Overshoot Day. So, for example, when we regulate the water environment, there's a lot of energy used in protecting the water environment, for example, in treatment plants. Now, we need not to reduce water quality outcomes, but we need to find a way, for example, that Scottish Water doesn't use as much energy in the way that it reduces those impact on water bodies. So you could have a situation in which people say, under these rules, under keeping pace, under integration, reduce greenhouse gases, get to net zero, and allow a little bit more pollution of rivers and lochs. We don't want to see that. We want the future of keeping pace to be, how do we change the whole system so we can reduce greenhouse gases and find innovative ways of meeting what's currently in the Water Framework Directive? I don't want any sacrifice of water quality to meet another environmental objective. So I think the best frameworks will be ones in keeping pace that pick up the later focus in Europe, the circular economy directives, green recovery, etc., which will enable bodies like SEPA to work with businesses, communities and other on integrated environmental management.
Mark, you have a question around this?
Yeah, I guess it's related, convener, and it's about the water industry. I'm just wondering, Terry, what your impressions are about how the water industry might change in the UK as a result of common frameworks, but also the internal market proposals. Do you see a shift, for example, in the way that we publicly own and regulate water in Scotland?
So again, there are some questions which are outside my remit, such as ownership, etc., is decisions for parliamentarians. The critical thing, so for example, we've got a publicly owned water monopoly. Now, the critical thing is whether it's publicly or privately owned, and people will have strong views on that. What I like about working in Scotland is that WICS, the economic regulator, DEPA is the environmental regulator, we sit down with Scottish Water and we talk about the broad outcomes that Parliament and government are asking us to jointly achieve. So the example I just gave, there will be some people who say, we've got to reduce greenhouse gases, we could put up with a little bit more water pollution. I sit there at that table and I say, no, that's not going to happen. What we have to do, for example, you won't need to use as much energy building and running treatment plants if the next housing development is built so it doesn't have any wastewater. Stop building in the old style to waste water. Now, I've been quite impressed with Scottish Water. Obviously, sometimes we take enforcement action against Scottish Water, so sometimes it's a difficult relationship. But we had a workshop with them recently at senior level saying, we're both trying to achieve net zero, we're both trying to protect the precious water of Scotland. How do we achieve both objectives? So again, I keep coming back to this, and it might sound like I'm a broken record, but it's because I believe in it so strongly. You have a clear platform of law which sets minimum standards, and then you have strong partnerships with a variety of people to say, how can we go beyond that and how can we achieve those multiple outcomes? So I think water in Scotland is, because we're abundant in it, we've got a lot of expertise in it, we've got some good relationships, we can really make our mark here. And that's a way of keeping pace with where the world needs to go. And I'd like us to be a pace setter, not just a pace keeper.
Thank you, Mark. I've got a final question for you both. It's come up, obviously. The UK government have an environmental bill, which is at very early stages right now. Scotland's not doing an environmental bill, but obviously we've got our green recovery and various iterations of the climate change plan. Do you see that as being a potential issue? We don't have an environmental bill as such happening in Scotland, and could there be an issue there with environmental targets being advanced more effectively by a bill down in the UK? Or do you just your general views on that? That's something that's come out with some of the submissions as a potential issue. Terry, just come to you before I come to Robbie.
Again, I'm not sure that the statutory basis is the key thing. I think the key thing is that there are targets that are set. What's more important for me is that the targets are set in relation to the economy and society. Because again, the example I just gave, water, Scotland has 90% of Scotland's fresh water. So we could just say, oh, we don't need to try too hard. But the whole world now is going to overuse water and we have to be a great steward of it. I turn that into a strength and say, not just how do we protect water quality in Scotland, but how do we use it to build a better economy, a better society, and one that we can take ideas to the world. Whether those sort of targets are set in statute or not, again, I don't think SEPA would have a strong view. For us, the most critical thing is that they're set well, they're owned by people and implemented well by bodies like SEPA.
Thank you. And Robbie, any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you, Convener. I think our view in NatureScot is probably broadly similar. I mean, we have an environment strategy in Scotland recently produced, and that does provide us with the vision. It provides us with the ambition, and in terms of how that translates into targets, I think we would probably have a similar view that targets and statute might not necessarily provide the flexibility that we need, but what we do need are the tools to deliver on that vision, the resources to deliver on that vision, and the collective desire to make it happen. And that does require that collaborative approach co-produced in setting those ambitious targets which are realistically able for us to achieve. So I think I agree with, broadly speaking, with what Terry said. And targets and statute for me, I think, does actually potentially cause problems for us as well.
Okay, thank you. Final question for you both from John Scott on common frameworks. John.
Thank you, Convener. I just want to know what needs to be done to move the common frameworks issue forward. I gather some are better developed than others, and you're both practical men, and I'm interested to know, in your view, what you think needs to be done to get this meat on the bones, so to speak, of these frameworks.
Comes Terry first.
Well, you say we're practical, it's not complicated, it's the people involved. We've just got to keep rolling up our sleeves and get on with it. There's not a lot of time to do it, and that's all that's needed. It's as simple as that.
Okay.
And Robbie Kernahan.
Yes, thank you, John, and perhaps not much more to add. A willingness to make it happen, as Terry says, rolling up the sleeves and make the best in what time we have left available.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank you both for your time this morning. As always, very informative. And if there's anything else that you wanted to add or follow up on, as I said, the door's always open. You know where to find us. I'm going to suspend this meeting until 10:55, where we'll have our second panel. Thank you. Welcome back. We continue taking evidence on the UK withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Bill. I'd like to welcome our next panellists this morning. We've got Karen Ramu, the Policy Advisor for Scottish Land and Estates. Good morning to you. I'd like to ask you something about your submission. SLE states in its submission, I'll quote, "We are concerned about there being substantial policy divergence throughout the UK and the likelihood that this could impact businesses which currently operate seamlessly throughout the UK." Could you outline your concerns around this for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So thank you for the question, convener, and good morning to the rest of the committee. I'll just highlight that actually part one of the bill is being actually dealt with by another colleague of mine, so we may need to provide a bit more supplementary information. But essentially our concerns really relate primarily to the potential negative consequences of I guess it goes back to earlier points that have been made by previous people giving evidence around sort of the unknowns in terms of internal markets and the development of that white paper into a bill. So, I mean, we accept that with devolution, you naturally get divergence. And I think that's where common frameworks play a really, really critical role in ensuring that any divergence that's likely to happen is not to a large scale or will have any sort of negative effect.
So I guess what the keeping pace part of the continuity bill, section 1, and you've already said it's another colleague deals with that, but in general that wants to uphold the standards, the environmental standards the EU have. Do you see that there's a potential with the internal market bill or maybe some trade arrangements that happen as a result of the UK's arrangements with other countries that there could be a lessening of environmental standards in the rest of the UK, with Scotland continuing to keep the same standards? Is that your primary concern?
I think it's, at the moment, we just don't really know how the 4 different jurisdictions are going to work together and implement the environmental principles. You know, common frameworks are still coming in terms of environmental and agricultural side of things. So I think it's almost, we don't really know enough at the moment to know what the impacts are really going to be. But I think in general, we just have this concern that because we don't know, there is an unknown, that there is potential there for significant divergence. That might not be the case, but I think until we have the full detail, it's very difficult to really comment further on that.
Yeah, you're just flagging it up, so to speak. I'll move to my colleague John Scott, who's a question on common frameworks. John.
Thank you, convener. And given that you have concerns, Karen, I mean, I would like to hear the positive side of that. And are you reassured that, given that the common frameworks relate to food and agriculture and the environment, that you reassured that these can allow for shared ambition across the 4 nations of the UK as well, notwithstanding your concerns? Tell us about the upside.
Yeah, so I guess the upside is what we're seeing in terms of the UK agricultural bill at the moment, which has progressed through the Lords Committee stage. And I think that stage has really highlighted an increased focus on the need to share ambition across the four nations. And we're really glad that issue has been raised, and that, you know, important reserve poll decisions do not disadvantage Scotland. So I think we have some comfort in respect to the way that bill is moving through, and the discussions around common framework. So I think there is recognition that there is this four nations approach needed, that joint sort of thought process are needed in terms of how common frameworks work, and that they shouldn't just be implemented by one body, that they need the buy-in and input of others. And I think we're moving in that direction. I think we feel fairly comfortable there.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I'm declaring an interest as a farmer, but I mean, the interconnectedness of agriculture and of food production right across the whole of the UK is intrinsic to our whole support of our society. So there is an absolute need for commonality of purpose and working in this regard, and goodwill all round. Want to comment on that, or would you agree with that?
I would absolutely agree. You know, I've not really got much more to add. I think that's absolutely key. I mean, I know you kind of want me to focus on the reassurances. If I could just raise one of the concerns that we have, is that it does appear at the moment that some conversations around common frameworks appear to be happening in terms of England conversations with another nation, rather than sort of all four nations jumping in and having input. So I think what you say, that collaboration, coordination is extremely important, and it's the only way that common frameworks are going to work.
Brilliant, thanks very much.
Thank you, John. I'm going to bring in Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to very briefly come in on the back of that and just see whether our concerns are primarily focused on outcomes, where I think we probably, across the four nations, will mostly share a view about outcomes, but we will have divergence on means. Now, the one that sort of comes into my mind, that we have different policy in relation to genetically modified foods in different parts of the UK, and that doesn't seem to cause great problems for the market, the internal market of which we are part at the moment, and the smaller internal market of which we will be part in future. So therefore, is it outcomes we're focused on, or is it something else?
Well, I think it's the mechanisms and the outcomes. So it's the mechanisms that you use to then reach the outcomes. I think that's kind of what is key. I mean, I'll probably stop there rather than dig myself into a big hole, because, as I say, this area very much lies with another colleague in SLE, and I would be far more comfortable if we could provide a bit more detail around our concerns and thinking on that question, if that's okay.
Thank you. Mark, you have some questions.
Yeah, good morning, Karen. Can I ask you about the additional environmental principles that SLE has proposed? If you just take us through those and what your rationale is for proposing those.
Yeah, so I guess like everybody else has kind of sort of said, we very much support the four key principles that have already been outlined in the bill. They kind of are the ones that are fundamental to environmental law. We kind of feel that the bill could be strengthened by some additional principles, and in particular, as highlighted by many others, the principle of integration we feel is absolutely key. And I think in particular, in respect to kind of the conversations that we've just had around potential divergence with four nations, I think that integration principle almost binds things together. And I think the current commitment that's offered by the EU, we don't feel is sort of honoured in this bill in terms of the lack of the integration principle. We feel that the bill could be much stronger in that commitment. And I suppose in terms of sort of how it then binds kind of other principles and how they work together, I think that's where the integration principle is really key. We have also suggested that other principles around sustainable development are included, which very much recognises the social economic factors, particularly in light of sort of the green economic recovery and the recovery from the COVID crisis. I think that's a really important one. But, you know, we do recognise that that is kind of supported in the proposed purpose of the bill as well. So I think to some extent we're not too precious about seeing that one included. Other ones around non-regression, I mean, I think that one's self-explanatory in the sense that we don't want to see a backward step in terms of how the environment is upheld. You know, we want to see kind of Scotland move forward and sort of achieve that gold star of current EU environmental thinking. And then another one that we suggested to be included was appropriate spatial and temporal scales. So again, the thinking behind that was just that it's really important that environmental issues are addressed at the appropriate scales. I think the key behind all of this is that it might be that, you know, once we have the actual guidance on the principles, we will better understand how they interact with one another. And essentially, I guess, you know, what do they mean and how do they interlink with other policies? So I suppose, you know, until we have that document, it's a little bit unclear in terms of how we then interpret the principles that exist at the moment.
Okay. Okay, thanks for that. Can I ask also, in terms of the duty to have regard to the principles, you would have heard, so there's various suggestions about how this can be interpreted, and you've suggested another one, which is act in accordance to the principles. I wonder if you could kind of flesh that out a little bit more.
Yeah, so I think just going on the back of sort of discussions, you know, we've been watching quite carefully the UK Environment Bill moving forward. We've picked up on conversations around sort of the wording that's been used there. And we just, you know, I think kind of like other panellists have suggested previously, we feel that there is an opportunity to strengthen the approach in terms of, and the wording around, you know, in which ministers should have regard for these principles. I think whatever the wording, it's important that there's transparency in the decision-making progress in accordance with the principles to allow effective oversight by the ESS. So we're not necessarily precious about our wording that we've suggested, and we fully take on board suggestions made by others, in particular Scottish Environment Link in their evidence session last week. But I think it's very much about ensuring that we live up to that duty and that high environmental expectation. So as I say, we're not massively precious about the wording, but we do feel it can be strengthened.
And do you have a view on the definition of environment that's in the bill? I mean, we heard some concerns of SNH. It doesn't necessarily include landscape or birds. So I don't know if that's something your members would have a view on.
Yeah, so I think in general we felt that the definition of environment was adequate, but we do accept that, you know, some concerns have been raised, as you've just suggested. And I think, you know, we would be open to sort of, you know, recognising that there has been emissions and that actually that the definition of environment could be strengthened. And of course, we've just seen that the UK Environment Bill, their definition has been amended to incorporate climate change targets as well, which, you know, we would welcome that sort of joint approach, I guess, essentially.
Thank you. Now some questions from Angus MacDonald.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Following up on the guidance on the principles, in your submission, Karen, you state, and I quote, "We believe the requirement for Scottish ministers to consult relevant public authorities or other appropriate persons who are subject to the principles duty prior to laying should be expanded to also include persons appearing in them to be representative of the interests of local government, industry, agriculture, fisheries or small businesses, and should also include consultation with the OEP." So I wonder if you could explain to us why expanding the list of those who should be consulted on development of the guidance should go beyond those to whom the guidance applies.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, we really support the process set out in the bill in terms of which, you know, places a requirement on Scottish ministers to consult on the guidance. And I think we feel that, you know, the environmental principles will affect all of us in our daily lives. And I think it's really important that if they're to succeed and, you know, and if they're taken on board, that people have a real clear understanding of what the principles mean, how they can be implemented. And I think in terms of the list of stakeholders that we referred to, I think essentially what we were trying to say is that we feel that actually there should just essentially be a public consultation on the guidance. I don't necessarily feel it should just be restricted to a select group of people. I think, you know, it's really important that the guidance on the principles is really coherent, and that, you know, everybody has an opportunity to input, and so that we're as clear as possible in terms of what the principles mean and how they can be implemented.
Okay, it's a valid point. Thank you.
Thank you, Angus. And now to Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Convener. I just want to explore SLE's views on the structure and staffing of the new environmental standards Scotland body. In particular, let me just start with what kind of people should be appointed to the board of ESS. Would you see it as a board that should primarily be led by people with skills and knowledge that are relevant to environmental issues, or do you think it should be a board that is representative of different interests that there are in relation to that? And of course, it's not to say it has to be one or the other, but which would be the higher priority in the view of SLE?
So I think it's really important that the ESS is made up of representatives from a breadth of different areas. It's really important that, you know, you've got perhaps environmental, land management, business, environmental law expertise in there. I think the key is to make this independent body as strong as possible and to be armed with the best expertise that is needed to do the job. Of course, there's potential options, you know, to kind of seek further advice out with on certain issues. But I think, you know, our preference would be that it's a mixed expertise and that it's a balanced organisation.
I noticed that one of the things you didn't say was the necessity of having people who understand the law that relates to environment, because the ESS is not the regulatory body or the body with oversight of the day-to-day operation, but the body that is holding other parts of the public domain to account on implementing the law. So I take it you would agree that it's important that we have people who understand environmental law and how that actually works as well.
Yeah, apologies, Stuart. I perhaps went through my answer too fast. I did mention environmental law, and I actually think it's very, very important that there is somebody or some bodies within the organisation that, as you say, does have an understanding. And yeah.
Well, that's fine. My apologies if I missed hearing you say it. I'm afraid that sometimes happens. The other thing related to the ESS, and you used the word in the answer you've just given to me, independent. Independent of ministers and able to act impartially is probably important, because in a sense they're holding the bodies that are responsible to ministers to account. How do you think in SLE that can best be achieved?
So I guess building on probably what's already been said by others, we feel it's incredibly important that the body is independent of ministers, and I think part of that needs to be that the recruitment, a lot of the recruitment process and sort of suggestion around expertise comes from the Scottish Parliament. It shouldn't be coming from Scottish ministers, and I think it's really important that there's no perception, because at the moment there does seem to be this underlying perception that, you know, Scottish ministers are quite involved in the process, and that they would benefit from taking a step back and for Scottish Parliament to be more involved. Something that could help with that process is to maybe employ rapporteurs, which could help assist in the recruitment process. And I think one of the key things that we would really like to see is that, you know, the ESS needs to have teeth to do its job. So alongside that independence, it needs to be adequately funded. And we'd like to see some sort of ring-fenced funding put aside for the body. We'd also like to see that perhaps at the end of each financial year, perhaps that the ESS reports on whether or not it's had sufficient funding to do its job adequately. And I think there's some of the real sort of key issues. I would also just refer to, I think it's scheduled to paragraph 1, where on the one hand it says that the ESS is very much independent of Scottish Government and the ministers, but then on the other hand there is a clause in there which almost contradicts that independence, and I know that's been highlighted by others as well, and I think we would very much support that clause essentially being amended or removed. If it's amended, we just want some clarity in terms of when that exemption can be used in the bill.
Yes, well, are you in effect saying that this is a body that should be appointed and paid for by the Scottish Parliament and not by the Scottish Government, as one or two others are, and that it would be the Parliament's public appointments? I just temporarily, my brain is fading. We have a committee that looks after public appointments, that it should be them who would be involved.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think our key line and thoughts on this is that it definitely needs greater Scottish parliamentary input, and I think that's an approach that we would welcome.
Okay, thank you, Convener.
Thank you, and we have a question from John Scott.
Okay, Convener, I'm just developing both Stuart Stevenson's point and SLE's point in this regard. I mean, what are you saying? Is that this should be essentially equivalent to an ombudsman type of structure, such as we already have in the Scottish Parliament? And if so, who would hold the ultimate position in this regard in terms of decision making? Would it be ESS, or would it be Scottish ministers, or would it be the courts? Finally, if there was a disagreement between this new body and Scottish ministers.
I think essentially what we're saying is that, you know, we very much welcome the independent body that's been set up. We feel that to some extent it meets the requirements, it's fit for purpose. I think there's some minor tweaks that need to be made in terms of just taking that step back to make sure that it does have sufficient independence, and a lot of that is essentially around the funding element and the recruitment process. So I don't think we're necessarily looking for a completely revised and new model. I think we're fairly happy and content with the proposed suggestion of the ESS. We'd just like to see those areas that I touched on previously strengthened slightly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, colleagues. I think that's all our questions. I want to thank Karen Ramu for her time this morning. We were going to have a 5-minute suspension to allow the third panellist to come in. So back in 5 minutes. Welcome back. We continue taking evidence on the UK withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Bill. I would like to welcome our final panellist this morning, and that is Dr. Annalise Saravese, the lecturer in environmental law at the University of Stirling. Thank you for joining us once again. You've been in front of us quite a few times, so it's nice to see you back. I'm aware that you are working with the Scottish Parliament Research Centre SPICE colleagues on a briefing which is exploring UK trade agreements and the potential impacts on environmental protection. Could you talk the committee through the background to your work and any emerging themes that you've found?
Indeed, thank you very much for inviting me again to talk to you. I have been working with SPICE on a briefing together with my colleague Filippo Fontanelli from the University of Edinburgh. And the aim of this briefing is to support members with their understanding of how ongoing trade negotiations, particularly with the EU and the US, are likely to impact the exercise of regulatory powers over environmental matters within the UK. So this briefing consists of a number of parts that deal specifically with examples of how trade agreements affect the exercise of regulatory powers at the national level. At the same time, we try to understand the implications for the Scottish lawmakers of the internal market rules and the proposals that are being put forward by the UK government. We know we don't know a lot about these proposals as yet, but the briefing tries to unpack some of the issues that underlie this matter for environmental standards and protection in Scotland.
I guess one of the questions that we all have is what is going to take precedence? What's going to be primacy in this? You know, is it the trade agreements, the internal market, and there's almost like 3 pillars of moving potential parts that could have an effect on environmental standards across the UK. I mean, there's so many unanswered questions at the moment. What are your immediate thoughts about that? Am I correct in my assessment of it being almost like 3 potential divergence issues?
So it's important to understand that with EU exit, there is a very fluid scenario taking place and materializing before our eyes. On the one hand, we have the external element, i.e. the constraints that come from the outside that are associated with trade agreements. Trade agreements, as a matter of course, affect the way a country exercises its regulatory powers in general, and in particular, we're talking about the environment now, so there are implications that are associated with trade in products. Now, this is going to happen more as a result of the new situations associated with EU exit. On the internal side, however, the UK is in a very peculiar situation that is associated with the fact that, as you well know, a devolution occurred in the context of EU membership. With EU exit, the uniting frame of EU law is being removed, which means that the elements that make the UK can move and are likely to move further apart. What measures will be taken by the UK in order to ensure that this doesn't affect trade internally are yet to be seen, but we can anticipate that things will happen there. And therefore, we have this moving landscape in front of us right now.
In terms of the continuity bill, do you see the continuity bill as being a potential solution to what we're talking about here?
Well, I think the continuity bill is trying to do what the Scottish government has said they wanted to do almost from day one after the EU referendum. I enable Scotland to keep pace with EU environmental standards after exit. The truth, though, is that the capacity of Scotland to keep pace with the EU will be constrained both by external trade agreements that the UK may make and is in the process of negotiating, both with the EU and the US, and at the internal level by any rules that are developed in order to ensure the internal market's integrity.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to some more specific questions from Mark Roscoe.
Yeah, thanks, convener, and good morning, Annalisa. I wanted to ask you about perhaps some specific examples where there's perhaps a lack of clarity about how the internal market arrangements will operate and how that might dovetail with trade agreements. One area that has been mentioned when we've been taking evidence in this committee by Professor Campbell-Gamble was in relation to the water industry and the market for utilities and whether those will be carved out of any internal market arrangements or international trade deals. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as a very specific example that's been raised with us. There have also been others around deposit return scheme operation across the UK, but there may be other examples as well.
Yes, and indeed the briefing will go into some level of detail on many of these examples that are either extant or fabricated in order to make the members understand what the various scenarios are. But to keep with the examples that you mentioned, I was thinking of what Campbell suggested in relation to water, and I do see this as an important area because there's clear divergence within the UK on level of compliance with EU water standards presently. So this could be an issue. But I think the areas where we are likely to see more tension is the products, you know, things that are treated like chemicals and or agriculture products. And here is where, for example, a ban on pesticides in Scotland, assuming that Scotland were ever to adopt one, would clearly make a very significant impact both on the internal UK market and on the external relations of the UK, if you see what I mean. So a measure like this would have, from now on, have to be assessed for its implications. And here it's where measures adopted by the UK may affect the exercise of regulatory powers of Scotland. We don't know very much about what the UK government proposes on this, but they've talked about market access and mutual recognition. If you think about the implications on principles such as these, it may entail that Scottish producers have to ban the use of pesticides. At the same time, other UK producers may not have to do that and still be able to freely sell their products within the UK. Now, you can imagine that this would create tensions, disadvantages for Scottish producers, and at the same time, issues of control and enforcement for Scotland. So these are all new, if you like, issues that have already materialized in the past in relation, for example, to GMOs, as was mentioned earlier, but they have become more pressing and more likely to arise now.
Mm-hmm. What do you see the role of corporate interests and sort of mediation within that process? So if I'm a company and I'm like Bayer, for example, I'm selling pesticides across the UK, you know, I want free access to the Scottish market. Do you think that sort of route for challenge of market rules and regulation will be enhanced through the UK internal market arrangements, or will it be weakened? I mean, what differs, I guess, from what Bayer might do within the European Union right now to challenge a decision, a directive on pesticides, compared to what might happen in the future with this situation outside of the European Union?
As you have mentioned, the EU single market is a good proxy for us to anticipate what may happen with the implementation, with the adoption and implementation of rules on the UK internal market. Why do I say that? Because over the years, the EU has developed quite a large body of law concerning the measures to protect the single market. And there is an example, very old example of legislation adopted in Denmark over recyclable bottles. And this is clearly relevant for the present context, not because the law is still relevant today, but just to give you an example of how legislation adopted in Denmark over recyclable bottles was challenged by the European Commission on grounds that it obstructed free trade within the single market. Now, this is an example of sorts of issues that may arise increasingly with policy divergence within the UK. And the adoption of rules on the internal market would be helpful in order to clarify who is in charge of what, should issues of coherence arise. As you know, in the EU, the Commission is the guardian of the integrity of the single market, and if necessary, can make recourse to the court in order to adjudicate on matters of compliance with rules. You can imagine a similar mechanism to be developed within the UK if there is an appetite for that. But it's important to note that the EU is not the only single market around, and there are other countries that have developed systems concerning the protection of the internal market. So I am aware that the Finance and Constitution Committee has already commissioned research on this. Professor Gemmell last week was mentioning the case of Australia and things that have happened in that jurisdiction. So it's important really to look at these models carefully, understand how they ensure divergence in the environmental standards and how these are tackled.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark. Questions from Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, convener. I want, if we can, to explore the things that taking a wrong turn and all this might stop us being able to do in Scotland. Clearly, there are examples of having different environmental standards baked into law north and south of the border. The obvious one would be the targets for greenhouse gas emissions, where the timetables are reasonably different north and south of the border, where the Scottish Government has aspirations, and it can't be legally enforced, in relation to propulsion systems for cars, which are different from south of the border. Now, these are just examples to try and sort of get us into the issue of what sort of things do you see that Scotland might not be able to take different viewpoints on that will affect our environment.
Again, I perhaps repeat myself, but one area where divergence is unlikely or unadvisable is the matter of chemicals regulation. This is a very complex and large area that is presently addressed by the EU through REACH, and I whole UK approach to a matter as complex as this would seem advisable. This doesn't mean that, for example, Scotland shouldn't consider going its own way regarding specific chemicals, but clearly doing chemicals regulation in Scotland independently and separately from the rest of the UK wouldn't make any sense. In as far as specific areas like ban of pesticides are concerned, what would need to happen right now more than in the past is really systemic analysis of compliance and logistical costs associated with the regulatory divergence within the UK. So if the UK doesn't align with EU standards anymore and Scotland wants to do that, I would imagine that a paramount consideration would have to be how much will it cost for Scotland to enforce different standards vis-a-vis the rest of the UK, and how will we ensure compliance?
Well, let me just take us to a specific thing then, because you referred to pesticides. Now, Scotland is further north than the rest of the UK, so therefore our biology, what's in nature, particularly in things like insects and so on and so forth, the mix is different in Scotland than it is in England. That's just a natural phenomenon related to where one is and what the climate is. So therefore, whenever you put a pesticide into the environment, you do so because you're looking for some positive benefit. But almost invariably, there will also be a negative benefit. But if the insects in particular in the north and south of the border between Scotland and the rest of the UK the balance is different, will Scotland be able to ban a pesticide that would particularly affect the insects in our environment, but because those insects are not so present, or perhaps they're present in such great numbers that the effect doesn't matter in England, the balance of why you would want to do it is quite different. Would we still be able to ban a pesticide that has a differential impact on our native species or the species we want to protect? And I only use that as one example.
Mm-hmm. And I hate to sound evasive, but the truth is, in lack of rules concerning the UK internal market, it's almost impossible to tell. What has happened, for example, in the EU, is been that the Court of Justice has adapted, has developed a case law requiring reasonable flexibility on part of EU member states. So there is room for divergence, and the principle of proportionality is also important there. Exactly as you mentioned here, there is an issue of divergence in habitats, and therefore different needs that may be paramount considerations. But in the case of Denmark, again, to go back to the example of bottles, the court was very careful in distinguishing what were the principle of proportionality and the exercise of legitimate the protection of legitimate interest vis-a-vis the rights of foreign manufacturers to use containers that were not those that the Danish government had authorized for trade within Denmark. So a balance of this kind will need to be struck, and this is why I cannot emphasize enough how having rules on these matters, on who is in charge of scrutinizing what and according to which criteria, is a good thing, not a bad one.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Stuart. And now to questions from John Scott.
I'm again declaring an interest as a farmer, and before I come to my main question, I'd just like to pick up on the question that Stuart Stevenson asked, essentially about the banning of insecticides and particularly neonicotinoids. And if that were to be implemented by the Scottish Government, thereby putting Scottish farmers at a disadvantage, as you earlier referred to, potentially with other UK farmers, would that be something that you would expect that the Scottish Government would compensate Scottish farmers for doing so by putting them at a competitive disadvantage with other UK farmers?
Again, it's a very hypothetical scenario we're discussing, and it's important to appreciate that all this is speculative, but what I would say is that there has been several examples in practice, as you will see from our briefing when it's published, of how the discrimination between producers has been addressed. And there are rules in these connections that have been developed internationally and applied to the external dimension that I referred to in the beginning of my presentation, and rules that are developed internally. We know next to nothing about the internal dimension now. Definitely adopting mitigating measures could be one way of dealing with this, but you have to consider that these are normally also an issue for the protection of free trade, and rules on this matter could be developed at the expense of the Scottish government, if you see what I mean, that preempt subsidies of this kind. Again, this is entire speculation. I do not know how the UK government will address this matter in legislation, and we will have to wait and see what they propose.
Thank you very much. I now want to come to the question that I was invited to ask, which was with regard to the development of frameworks. And can you tell us how the pace of development of common frameworks is compounding the issues that you've already raised?
I hear many of the other expert witnesses have already expressed regret over the slow development of common frameworks. This was an area that was highlighted from day one as an urgent concern. We are clearly running against the clock here, and I don't want to repeat the obvious, but we are in need for clarity on so many areas still, and this is a great concern.
You're obviously well informed on the subject. What do you see as the pinch points that need particular, shall we say, political pressure put on to get these common frameworks to move on?
To be honest, I am an outside observer, and I don't know what the dynamics within the rooms where these matters are being discussed are. What I imagine is that the pandemic has clearly affected progress. At the same time, it's true that there have been obvious political tensions as well, have not helped progress on these issues, partially because the constitutional questions tend to take primacy over technical questions at times, and this is the place where we are.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Stuart wanted to come back in before I go to Liz Smith. Stuart.
Sort of to put on the record, as a matter of principle, if John thinks farmers should be compensated if neonicotinoids have a negative effect on them, whether he correspondingly means that if neonicotinoids, which are known to affect bees and wasps and so on, that are part of the fertilization process of many of our plants, if banning that improved the fertilization farmers, would he also be expecting that farmers would need to return that benefit to the government for spending in other areas of policy? But I'm just making that observation. It's not a genuine question, Convener. But I think John ought to think carefully about the principle behind what he said, because I suspect he wouldn't agree with the proposition I've just made.
Your comments are on the record, and I imagine that the two of you will have a rigorous conversation about it when you next see each other in person. I'm going to go to Liz Smith.
I wonder if I could ask what's maybe a bit of a leading question. I think we're all agreed, irrespective of our party politics, that the key message is to ensure that we get better economic growth, jobs, investment, and that both Scotland and the UK can feel comfortable with whatever arrangements are put in place from that economic perspective. And what I would like to ask you, from your very considerable legal expertise, do you feel at the moment that the key issue is that the UK government has not given sufficient information in the bill to how that could be progressed? And obviously there's been criticism they haven't taken on board some of the considerations of the devolved institutions, or whether there are actually fundamental issues at stake that might create difficulties because of the legal networks that will be set up? Is it a question, therefore, of not having enough information just now or enough detail, or whether you think that there are fundamental problems in the proposed structures?
We have, I think, had the chance in this committee before to consider the peculiarities of UK's constitutional setup, and this is definitely not a good time to enter a grand design exercise. I appreciate that this would be very unwelcome given the pressures that both the Scottish and the UK parliaments are under. At the same time, it's true that all these technical issues that we have been addressing and raising are affected by great uncertainty concerning a set of constitutional questions that are not clearly answerable. And it's not me saying that, it's been repeated at length by several experts before this and other committees. So the lack of clarity in the constitutional setup means that coming up with clear solutions that are the result of existing arrangements is not immediate. And this is where the difficulties concerning the development of common frameworks are. At the same time, the UK is not alone in the logjam concerning the pandemic. I mean, it's subjective. There has been so much delay everywhere with the legislative work across the board because of the pandemic. So it's definitely not a helpful or auspicious set of circumstances we are in.
Okay, that's very helpful. My second question, which is based on some of the concerns that we've heard already, is about the relationship that Scotland has with some of its key partners. And one of these within the UK is the Northern Ireland situation. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about that? Because I understand you've got some expertise in that area.
You heard last week from a colleague, Professor Gravy from Belfast, and I do think that she has touched very well on some of the key issues there. Northern Ireland will have to align with EU standards, and this raises internal market questions concerning the position of Northern Ireland vis-à-vis the rest of the UK. But in as far as Scotland specifically is concerned, this also raises issues because there are competition, tensions there. Northern Ireland and Scotland being in the same markets for certain products. Northern Ireland will have to align, may get special treatment within the internal market in the UK. What the position of Scotland will be is unclear, but for sure, Scotland will not get this freedom to align all the time with the EU. It will be constrained by UK internal market rules in all likelihood.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Members don't seem to have any more questions. Dr. Savarese, is there anything else that you would like to add that you think that you should draw to our attention, that we should be bearing in mind, particularly as we have the Cabinet Secretary in front of us next week?
I would just suggest that the committee take a look at the briefing that I prepared with Dr. Fontanelli and indeed consider perhaps having a session with him, because he's been advising the Scottish Parliament on the trade implications of EU exit for a long time, and definitely a conversation on environmental standards is important in that specific context, and this is why we prepared the briefing in the first place. This is definitely something that needs to be taken under control moving forward, and as I said, there are costs and logistical implications of regulatory divergence within the internal market that are associated with environmental services and products. So it's definitely important to keep a close eye on these issues moving forward.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you for your time this morning, as always, very informative. That ends our session today. Our next meeting on the 1st of September, we'll hear from the Cabinet Secretary for the Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform and from the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs on the UK withdrawal and the European Union Continuity Scotland Bill. And we'll also consider the Climate Change Act of 2008, Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Order 2020. And that concludes the public part of our meeting today. Thank you all.